The industrial era, a time of incredible invention and change, has a dark shadow hanging over it. This shadow was cast by the tiny figures of children, some as young as 5 or 6, who were sent to work instead of to school. Child labor wasn't just about kids helping out on the family farm. This was different. It meant long, grueling hours in dangerous, soul-crushing environments for wages that were barely enough to survive on. These children were a crucial part of the industrial workforce, their small bodies and nimble fingers seen as assets by factory owners who were hungry for profit. They were the invisible engine powering a new world, but their own futures were being extinguished with every shift they worked. We have to ask ourselves, why did this happen on such a massive scale? The answer is a difficult mix of poverty and progress. As families moved from the countryside into the rapidly growing cities, they were desperate. There weren't enough jobs for adults and the wages were shockingly low. A child's small income, no matter how tiny, could be the difference between having a meal on the table and going hungry. For many parents, sending their children to work wasn't a choice they wanted to make. It was a choice they felt they had to make to keep the family from falling apart completely. They were trapped in a system that demanded cheap labor, and their children were the cheapest labor available. At the same time, the new factories and mines were designed in a way that made child workers seem almost necessary. The machinery was massive and complex, but there were small, tight spaces that only a child could reach into. If a thread broke deep inside a spinning machine, a small child could be sent in to fix it, often while the machine was still running. Their size made them ideal for tasks that were too difficult or dangerous for adults. This demand from factory owners, combined with the desperation of families, created a perfect storm. It created a system where children were seen not as children, but as miniature workers, replaceable cogs in a giant, unforgiving industrial machine. So when we look back at the towering smokestacks and marvel at the innovations of the industrial era, we have to remember who paid the price for that progress. It was a generation of children who were robbed of their childhoods. They were denied an education, the chance to play, and the simple right to grow up in a safe and nurturing environment. Their stories are a vital part of this history, a stark reminder that economic booms can be built on the backs of the most vulnerable. Understanding their reality is the first step toward understanding the true cost of this transformative period in human history. The places where these children worked were nothing short of terrifying. Textile factories were some of the most common employers of children. The air was thick with cotton dust, so much so that it was hard to breathe, leading to serious lung diseases. The noise from the massive looms was deafening, a constant thunderous roar that never stopped. Children would spend 12 to 14 hours a day on their feet, running back and forth, tying broken threads or crawling under the dangerous machinery to clear jams. A moment's distraction could mean losing a finger, a hand, or even their life, as they were easily caught in the fast-moving belts and gears that drove the factory floor. Mines were another circle of hell for child laborers. Known as trappers, some of the youngest children would sit in total darkness for up to 12 hours a day, their only job to open and close a heavy wooden door to let the coal carts pass through. The isolation was maddening, the darkness absolute. Older boys, called breakers, would sit for hours on end, hunched over, separating lumps of coal from slate and rock. The air was choked with coal dust and their hands were often cut and bleeding from the sharp edges of the rock. Cave-ins, explosions, and flooding were constant threats, making the mines one of the most dangerous workplaces imaginable for anyone, let alone a child. Even outside the factories and mines, children were put to work in grueling conditions. On farms, they weren't just doing simple chores, they were part of an industrial agricultural system. They worked long hours under the hot sun, planting and harvesting crops, often for very little pay. In the cities, you'd find them working as chimney sweeps, forced to climb into narrow, soot-filled chimneys that were often still hot. This was incredibly dangerous work. They could get stuck, suffocate from the fumes, or fall. Others worked as matchstick dippers, handling hazardous white phosphorus that could cause a horrifying disease called phossy jaw, which would rot away their jawbones. Across all these jobs, the story was the same. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and incredibly dangerous. There were no safety regulations, no one looking out for their well-being. A child was simply a tool to be used until they were worn out or broken. Whether they were breathing in cotton fibers in a mill, sitting alone in the dark of a mine, or risking their lives in a chimney, their childhood was being systematically destroyed. The variety of jobs was wide, but the outcome was tragically consistent, a life of toil and suffering with little hope for anything better. The impact of this labor on a child's life was devastating, affecting every part of their existence. Physically, their bodies were often stunted and deformed. The long hours of standing or hunching over machinery caused their bones to grow incorrectly, leading to lifelong disabilities. Malnutrition was rampant, as their meager wages could barely afford enough food to sustain them through their grueling workdays. Their health was constantly under attack, from the lung diseases caused by dust-filled air to the injuries inflicted by dangerous, unguarded machines. These weren't just accidents, they were an expected part of the job, and there was no compensation or medical care for a child who got hurt. Beyond the physical toll, their minds and spirits were crushed. With days spent entirely at work, there was absolutely no time for education. Most of these children could not read or write, trapping them in a cycle of poverty that was nearly impossible to escape. Without an education, they had no hope of ever getting a better job or improving their situation. Their future was decided for them the moment they stepped into the factory. The very concept of a childhood, a time for play, learning and discovery, was a luxury they couldn't afford. Their world was confined to the four walls of the factory or the darkness of the mine. But in the midst of this darkness, some people started to see the injustice and decided they had to do something. Reformers, like social activists, writers, and politicians, began to speak out against the horrors of child labor. They wrote articles, gave speeches, and published shocking photographs that exposed the brutal reality of these children's lives to the wider public. People like Lord Shaftesbury in Britain fought tirelessly in Parliament to change the laws. These reformers argued that a society that built its success on the suffering of children was not a successful society at all. They believed every child deserved protection, education, and a chance at a real future. Slowly but surely, their efforts began to make a difference. The first laws were small steps, but they were crucial. The Factory Acts in Britain, for example, started by limiting the number of hours a child could work and setting a minimum age, even if it was as low as 9 years old. These early laws were often poorly enforced, as factory owners would lie about children's ages or hide them during inspections. But they were a start. They established the principle that the government had a responsibility to protect its youngest and most vulnerable citizens. It was the beginning of a long, hard-fought battle to reclaim childhood from the clutches of industry. The fight to end child labor in the West was a long and difficult one, stretching over many decades. It wasn't just one law that changed everything, but a slow, gradual shift in society's thinking. As more laws were passed, setting higher age limits and shorter working hours, the demand for child workers began to decline. Compulsory education laws were also a game changer. When children were legally required to be in school, it became much harder for factories to employ them. This combination of legal protection and the growing importance of education slowly dismantled the system that had chained so many children to a life of labor. Looking back at this dark chapter is absolutely essential, because it teaches us so much about progress and its hidden costs. It reminds us that new technologies and economic growth don't automatically benefit everyone. In fact, without strong ethical guidelines and protections, they can cause immense suffering for the most vulnerable people in society. The story of child laborers during the industrial era is a powerful warning. It shows us what happens when the pursuit of profit is valued more than human dignity and well-being. It forces us to ask critical questions about who benefits from progress and who pays the price. Even though we've made huge strides, this history is not just history. While widespread child labor is a thing of the past, in countries like the UK and the US, it still exists in many parts of the world today. Children are still working in dangerous conditions, making clothes, mining for minerals used in our electronics, and harvesting the food we eat. The same forces of poverty and corporate demand that fueled child labor in the 19th century are still at play. Knowing what happened back then helps us recognize the injustice happening now and understand our responsibility to do something about it. Ultimately, the story of child labor during the industrial era is a lesson in empathy and social responsibility. It's a reminder that laws and societal norms can and must change to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The fight for the rights of a child, the right to education, to health, and to a childhood, is a continuous one. By remembering the soot-stained faces and tired eyes of the children who powered the first factories, we honor their stolen lives. And we arm ourselves with the knowledge and the conviction to ensure that no child has to endure what they went through ever again.